When we look back at the legacy of Battlefield 1, it's not hard to feel a sense of awe at the game's ambition, at least for lack of a better term. Its willingness to shake off the modding trappings so familiar to the shooter genre and embrace something, well, a little bit more historic, more grounded in some ways, and arguably more courageous. Released in 2016, Battlefield 1 was never really hitting that mainstream audience, at least in genre. The World War I genre has been plagued with so many failures in the past, just because it doesn't have the same media attention as the Second World War, and it doesn't have the same kind of hype around it. Kind of odd when you're talking about lots of death and mustard gas. But in 2016, when DICE and EA published Battlefield 1, it was a bold step into this time era that was so few and far between in the gaming landscape, and ironically, that jump back felt startlingly fresh. The juxtaposition of the promotion of BF1 alongside Call of Duty's Infinite Warfare, their once again modern retreading of everything they've done before, captured players and almost made it too clear which side people were going to take this time. The landscape of multiplayer shooters at the time was dominated by these near-future settings or even advanced warfare, leaving so many fans yearning for something different. So Battlefield 1 was to deliver on that promise, transporting players to this grim, muddy trenches and chaotic battlefields of World War I, a conflict so rarely explored within video games, or at least at such a grand scale. To really appreciate what this game achieved though, let's rewind the clock to its development phase. After a modern-day theatric of Battlefield 3, and of course Battlefield 4 as well, the then recent Cops and Robbers spin-off Battlefield Hardline ended up in failure. DICE now had a decision to make. The franchise was respected for its large-scale warfare, destructible environments, and team-based multiplayer, but after years of leaning towards present-day or futuristic settings, the developers sensed a need to surprise their audience. Rumors began circulating around the studio about tackling an era that mainstream gaming had never fully realized: the First World War. It was a daunting choice. Many considered World War I to be too slow or too outdated for a modern FPS, or simply just too dark and muddy to translate into something both fun and authentic. But DICE was resolute. They recognized the war's scope, the variety of theater and the blend of old war tactics and early mechanized warfare. It would introduce a fresh flavor to the series. From the outset, the development team focused on research. They pored over historical texts, studied vintage photographs, and traveled to museums to understand the weaponry, uniforms, and technology of the era. They also wanted to capture the global sense of this conflict. While the popular image of World War I often centers on the Western Front, DICE wanted to capture the lesser-known fronts like the Italian Alps or the deserts of the Middle East. They aimed to bring not just authenticity, but also a feeling of diversity into the game's maps and factions, and that single-player narrative, as we'll get onto very soon. The DICE art team pushed the Frostbite engine to handle not only dirty trenches and rolling fields in France, but the sun-baked deserts, shattered villages, and snow-capped mountain fortresses. Each environment was painstakingly designed to look beautiful, yet lived in, reflecting both the grand scale of the war and the human stories tucked behind it. EA's promotional campaign for Battlefield 1 struck a chord with players from the very beginning. The game was officially unveiled through a spectacular reveal trailer in May of 2016. The trailer quickly became one of the most liked trailers of all time on YouTube, setting a tone of excitement that few anticipated. The footage highlighted cavalry charges, biplane dogfights, trench warfare, and a kind of visceral brutality that felt leagues away from the slick hyper-tech of many other FPS games. The marketing leaned into contrasts: old guns that jammed and overheated instead of laser precision weapons, unpredictable artillery barrages, and the awe of early tanks lumbering across cratered fields. The tagline, "A war to end all wars," seemed fitting, resonating strongly with an audience hungry for something different. The build-up to release was accompanied by a public beta and community testing sessions. Players who got their hands on the Scenario Desert map during this open beta experienced thunderous galloping of horses, unpredictable weather patterns affecting visibility, of course sandstorms, and the chaotic dynamic objectives that shifted with the capture points. Critics and fans alike were impressed by the sheer scale and how this, old-era weaponry felt. It was slower, more deliberate, but still skill-based and rewarding. Reactions were overwhelmingly positive, which only fueled the hype machine for the months leading up to the launch. Upon release, Battlefield 1's reception was largely triumphant. Many critics praised the bold setting and noted that the game captured a kind of raw tension absent from futuristic shooters. Reviewers hailed the game's outstanding sound design. Rifles had startling cracks, artillery shells whistled menacingly overhead, and the roar of approaching tanks felt truly ominous. The The Frostbite engine's lighting and particle effects created some of the best visuals in the franchise's history. The single-player campaign, something that has been truly lacking in previous Battlefield games, was now structured as an anthology of war stories. This really stood out. Instead of one continuous narrative, it told several short tales from different theaters of war, each featuring a distinct character and scenario. Players piloted biplanes over the Western Front, fought as Italian shock troopers high in the Alps, experienced guerrilla tactics of Lawrence of Arabia's rebels, and whilst every story was not equally compelling, critics appreciated that DICE at least attempted to humanize this conflict that really was a tricky situation to tackle, giving players small windows into the lives of soldiers and civilians caught up in this calamity. Multiplayer, though, is always the heart of Battlefield, and it was no different in BF1. The game shipped with a variety of modes, some returning staples like Conquest and Rush, and others refined or newly introduced ones. One standout was Operations, a mode that stringed multiple maps and objectives in this narrative-driven multiplayer experience. Attacking teams would push across sectors, trying to break entrenched defenders, resulting in tug-of-war matches that felt massive and cinematic, and boy, is this game one of the most cinematic even to this day. When one sector would fall, the fighting would move onto another map, carrying the narrative of the front line shifting back and forth. This mode alone showed DICE's commitment to large-scale, immersive battles that felt like historical campaigns rather than disjointed skirmishes. The introduction of behemoths, giant powerful vehicles like the armored train or the airship, was another key feature. They were giving losing teams a help to turn the tide by creating these dynamic swings in the match momentum, and of course you'd be able to see them cascade down from the sky when they inevitably were taken out. Class-based gameplay remained a core pillar. The assault, medical, support, and scout classes each had their roles and tools, ensuring teamwork was rewarded. Unlike modern shooters, where gadgets and tech define how players support each other, Battlefield's classes relied on more rudimentary means. Bandages instead of defibrillators, flare guns for spotting enemies, and mortar emplacements instead of guided missiles. Even so, these differences didn't diminish the complexity or strategy. In fact, many players argued that the simplicity of the weaponry made each kill feel more earned and each victory that much more satisfying. Still, Battlefield was not without its criticisms. Some longer-term fans noted the lack of depth in weapon customizations compared to previous entries, while others lamented on the initial shortage of maps. There was also discussions about historical accuracy. Whilst DICE strived for authenticity in the look and feel of equipment and environments, they also balanced playability and fun over strictly adhering to the war's exact conditions. Purists complained that the games displayed too broad a range of weapons being widely available, or that sometimes it mixed factions and front in non-historical ways. But many players forgave these liberties, seeing them as necessary concessions to the gameplay balance and overall entertainment. Post-launch support rolled through a series of expansions. They Shall Not Pass, In the Name of the Tsar, Turning Tides, and Apocalypse. Each expansion added new maps, weapons, operations, and sometimes even new armies such as the French and Russian forces. This process was not always smooth though. Fans voiced frustrations about the game's premium pass model, which locked new content behind additional paywalls. DICE attempted to address these complaints over time, offering premium friends and trials to let non-owners experience some content, but the player base still felt fragmented. This fragmentation led the developers in future installments of the franchise to abandon the premium model for free post-launch content, but at the time, it really was a sticking point. Despite these hiccups though, the expansions were mostly well received, each bringing their own distinct flavor and front. They Shall Not Pass introduced the French army, their iconic fortress maps and brutal trench warfare. In the Name of the Tsar brought the massive freezing landscapes of the Eastern Front and the Russian Civil War echoes. Turning Tide shifted the focus to amphibious warfare around the Gallipoli Peninsula, and Apocalypse, fittingly dark, showcased war at its most horrific and some of the game's most intense and gritty maps. Community reception evolved over time. Early in its life, Battlefield 1 enjoyed a massive surge of players who were drawn to the fresh setting. The player count was high and the enthusiasm intense. Yet as months and years passed, the initial wave receded. Some players drifted away to other titles or even back to the modern and futuristic shooters that often offered deeper customization. The historical setting, whilst initially a breath of fresh air, didn't lend itself to the kind of long-term, incremental weapon progression that some players craved. Nevertheless, a dedicated core community remained. They cherished the game's unique era and authenticity in its battles, and the constant intensity that came from infantry and cavalry fighting under the roar of lumbering tanks and chaotic artillery. Esports never really truly took off for BF1, as it wasn't structured around the tight balanced maps and controlled arenas that competitive communities often need. Instead, the game excelled at immersive, large-scale warfare and felt more cinematic than any other title. Now, revisiting Battlefield 1 years after its release, its atmosphere is its selling point. The game design and visuals have aged gracefully, and the decision to go back to World War I ensuring the game's aesthetic remained distinctive. In a landscape filled with modern or futuristic shooters, Battlefield 1 still looks and feels unique. It has a cohesive identity, one that even now sets it apart, and many players and reviewers have called the game one of the best in the franchise. Not necessarily because it was flawless, but because it took risks. The final product stood as a confident assertion that historical shooters can still be fun, still be rich with tactical depth, and still be visually and sonically thrilling. When considering its competition, the game launched in a busy period of the FPS genre. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare released around the same time, and the contrast couldn't have been starker. With Infinite Warfare leaning into these space battles and futuristic weaponry, Battlefield 1 embraced the past. The community reaction, well, said it all. Over time, the game's legacy solidified. After a subsequent release of BF5, which ventured into the Second World War, and 2042, which went back to those modern futuristic battlefields, many fans now look back on Battlefield 1 with even greater fondness. BF5 has now improved on some of the gameplay and elements, and yet it still struggled with its own identity and post-launch content. 2042, well, that's an entirely different issue altogether. In the years since its release, the player base of Battlefield 1 has understandably thinned, but it has never truly vanished. You can still actually join servers and experience this role-playing of chaotic trench charges and biplane dogfights if you so wish. Because, well, it kind of stands now in a revered historical position within the franchise. It proved that going back in time could be commercially viable and creatively energizing. Although it was a risk, the decision to explore World War I resonated with audiences and critics, shaking up the genre that often felt stuck in familiar loops. The game served as a reminder that authenticity, when handled thoughtfully, can enhance a gaming experience rather than limit it. In retrospect, BF1's development also marked a new evolution in how DICE approached single-player storytelling. The War Stories format tried to break out from the linear hero narrative, and has each vignette offering a slice of the global conflict, and they brought it back for Battlefield 5, and yet since then, despite it being dropped, I think it was one of the best decisions that EA and DICE made. Today, you may find that returning to Battlefield 1 feels like slipping into a time machine. Not just back into the First World War, but back into a moment in gaming when we realized that there's still a lot of ground to cover in the shooter genre. Whether you remember storming through the mud and the wire of the Somme, defending the fortress high in the Italian Alps, or soaring through stormy skies in canvas-winged biplanes, Battlefield 1 likely left an imprint on your gaming memory. Perhaps it rekindled an interest in history, inspired an appreciation for older firearms and tactics, or simply reminded you that there's more to warfare than what we've come to understand with modern drones and laser sights. It's worth remembering that Battlefield 1's journey from concept to commercial success was never a guaranteed victory. It required a willingness and a development team that wanted to take a risk, and a community that embraced something out of the ordinary. The end result was a game that managed to both stand firmly on the lineage of the Battlefield franchise and also stand apart, doing something daring and original. Battlefield 1's legacy is one of immersion, authenticity balanced with playability, and a reminder that sometimes looking into the past can propel your series forward. It will likely remain for the rest of time a highlight of Battlefield and the franchise as a whole. A time that captivated millions of people over the world and joined them together rather than dividing them, which seems so common in 2025.